Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Viktor Frankl, the physician who found meaning in the darkest valleys of human suffering. Together and apart, they explored the deepest wells of human purpose, Jung descending into the mythic depths of psyche, Frankl ascending toward the transcendent heights of spirit. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the question of human purpose, one seeing meaning emerge from the depths of the unconscious through symbol and archetype, the other discovering meaning in the conscious choice to affirm life even in extremity. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Frankl as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. Our story begins not in Switzerland or Austria, but in the nature of human questioning itself. Before either man was born, the question hung in the air of European consciousness like morning mist. What gives life meaning? Not the mechanical meaning of cause and effect, but the felt sense that existence points towards something, matters in some way, that cannot be reduced to biology or physics. This question would shape both men's lives, though they would answer it from vastly different positions on the landscape of human experience. Carl Gustav Jung emerged into consciousness in 1875. Born into a world still thick with 19th century certainties. His father was a rural pastor, a keeper of traditional Christianity's symbolic world. His mother possessed what Jung would later recognize as a dual nature, shifting between conventional domesticity and strange, oracular pronouncements that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the personal self. The young Carl grew up surrounded by religious imagery, biblical narrative, and the rituals of Swiss Protestant life. Yet beneath this surface ran deeper currents: his father's growing spiritual doubts, his own early experiences of the numinous, dreams that seemed to carry messages from regions unknown. Jung's childhood was marked by solitude and introspection. He discovered early that his inner world was vast and populated by figures that did not seem entirely of his own making. He carved a small wooden man and hid it in the attic, a secret companion and guardian. He had dreams of underground chambers and mysterious gods. He experienced the world as alive with psychological presence, everything potentially significant, resonant with meaning that went beyond the surface appearance of things. When he encountered philosophy as a young man, he found words for what he had always sensed: that consciousness was not simple, that the psyche contained multitudes, that beneath the rational daylight mind lay darker, stranger, more ancient modes of knowing. His medical training at the University of Basel brought him into contact with psychiatry, a field then struggling to understand the vast territory of mental illness. He chose psychiatry deliberately, drawn by its position at the boundary between body and spirit, matter and meaning. At the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital under Eugen Bleuler, Jung began his word association, experiments, discovering that certain words triggered delayed responses, emotional reactions, patterns that suggested complexes, autonomous clusters of emotional and cognitive material that behaved almost like separate personalities within the larger personality. Here was evidence that the psyche was not unitary, not simply ego and will, but a kind of ecology of semi-independent elements. His meeting with Sigmund Freud in 1907 represented a crucial turning point. For several years, Jung served as Freud's closest collaborator, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. But fundamental differences emerged. Freud saw the unconscious as primarily personal, composed of repressed infantile wishes and traumatic memories. Jung increasingly sensed something more, a deeper layer of psyche that was not personal at all, but collective, transpersonal, mythological. When the break came in 1913, it was not merely professional, but existential. Jung entered what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of profound psychological crisis during which he actively engaged with the images and figures rising from the depths of his psyche. He recorded these encounters in what would become the Red Book, a profound document of inner exploration. From this crucible emerged Jung's mature vision. The psyche, he concluded, was not merely shaped by personal history, but was continuous with something larger, the collective unconscious, a repository of universal patterns he called archetypes. These archetypal patterns manifested in myths, fairy tales, religious symbols, and dreams across all cultures. The self, distinct from the ego, represented the larger totality of the personality, the organizing center that the ego served. The process of individuation described the lifelong journey toward wholeness, the gradual integration of unconscious contents into conscious awareness. Meaning, in Jung's framework, was not something one imposed on, life, but something one discovered by attending to the symbolic language of the unconscious. Dreams were messages, symptoms were symbols. Neurosis was the psyche's way of demanding that consciousness expand to include what had been left out. By the 1920s and 30s, Jung had developed an elaborate psychological system. He traveled to Africa, India, and the American Southwest, seeking evidence of the collective unconscious in diverse cultures. He studied alchemy, seeing in its mysterious imagery a symbolic map of psychological transformation. He analyzed thousands of dreams, traced mythological motifs across civilizations, explored the psychology of religion and the religious function of the psyche. His vision was essentially mythological. He saw human life as embedded in a vast symbolic drama, where individual struggles recapitulated eternal patterns. Suffering, in his view, resulted from the ego's resistance to the self's demands, from one-sidedness, from the repression of shadow material, from the loss of connection to the archetypal depths. Healing came through reconnection with the symbolic layer of experience, through active imagination, dream work, and the gradual expansion of consciousness to include more of the psyche's totality. Jung's approach was deeply rooted in symbol and image. He trusted the psyche's inherent tendency toward healing and wholeness. He believed that neurosis often contained the seeds of development, that the symptom pointed toward what consciousness needed to integrate. His therapy involved amplification, taking a dream image and exploring its mythological and cultural resonances, thereby connecting the individual's experience to the larger patterns of human meaning-making. He saw the psyche as possessing its own wisdom, its own teleology. The analyst's role was not to direct or instruct, but to facilitate the individual's encounter with their own unconscious, to help them learn the symbolic language through which the deeper layers of psyche communicated. This was the Jung who existed as Viktor Frankl was coming into his own as a thinker. Yet their worlds, at first, seemed entirely separate. Viktor Emil Frankl was born in 1905 in Vienna, 30 years after Jung, into a world very different from the pastoral Swiss landscape of Jung's youth. Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, was the epicenter of intellectual and artistic ferment, the city of Freud and Mahler, Klimt and Schnitzler, a place where the old certainties of the Habsburg Empire were dissolving into modernist experimentation. Frankl grew up in this atmosphere of cultural richness and underlying anxiety, a middle-class Jewish family in a city that would soon be transformed by forces neither Jung nor the young Frankl could fully anticipate. From early adolescence, Frankl was drawn to questions of meaning and purpose. At age 3, he decided he wanted to be a physician. As a teenager, he began corresponding with Freud, even publishing a paper in Freud's International Journal of Psychoanalysis at age 19. But Frankl's temperament was not purely psychoanalytic. He was also drawn to Alfred Adler's individual psychology, with its emphasis on goals, purposes, and the forward-looking aspects of human striving. For a time, he was part of Adler's circle, until disagreements led to his departure. Even in these early years, Frankl was searching for something beyond the deterministic frameworks of classical psychoanalysis, something that accounted for the human capacity to transcend circumstances, to choose one's attitude, to find or create meaning even in difficult situations. As a young psychiatrist in Vienna during the 1930s, Frankl specialized in the treatment of suicidal patients. This work brought him face to face with existential despair, people who saw no reason to continue living, who experienced life as meaningless. Traditional psychiatric approaches often pathologized such feelings, but Frankl increasingly saw them as philosophical and spiritual crises rather than merely symptoms of mental illness. He began to develop what he called logotherapy, from the Greek logos, meaning reason or meaning. The central premise was simple yet profound. The primary motivational force in human beings is not pleasure, as Freud argued, or power, as Adler suggested, but the search for meaning. When meaning is absent or blocked, people experience what Frankl termed existential frustration or existential vacuum, a hollowness, a sense of futility, a wondering what it's all for. But Frankl's theories remained relatively undeveloped until history intervened with terrible force. In 1942, Frankl, his wife, and his parents were deported to Nazi concentration camps. His father died in Theresienstadt, his mother and brother were killed in Auschwitz, his wife died in Bergen-Belsen. Frankl himself survived nearly 3 years in 4 different camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau, enduring conditions of such extremity that they stripped away everything except the bare fact of existence itself. It was in the camps that Frankl's ideas were tested in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable. Here, in circumstances designed to reduce human beings to mere survival machines, Frankl observed something remarkable, that even in these conditions of absolute powerlessness, a certain inner freedom remained. The Nazis could control every external aspect of the prisoners' lives, but they could not determine how those prisoners chose to experience their suffering. Some prisoners, facing the same horrors, descended into brutality or despair. Others maintained their humanity, found ways to transcend their circumstances, discovered meaning even in the midst of meaninglessness. Frankl watched fellow prisoners share their last piece of bread, comfort the dying, maintain their inner dignity when all outer dignity had been stripped away. Frankl himself survived in part by clinging to several sources of meaning. He reconstructed in his mind a manuscript he had been writing on logotherapy, which had been confiscated upon his arrival at the camp. He imagined giving lectures after the war about what he was learning in the camps. He thought of his wife, not knowing she was already dead, and found in his love for her a reason to endure. He looked for opportunities, however small, to exercise choice, to give his bread to someone needier, to offer a word of encouragement, to resist the inner deadening that the camps imposed. These acts of inner freedom, he realized, were the essence of being human. Even when all external freedom is removed, the freedom to choose one's attitude remains. This was the core insight that would define his later work. When the camps were liberated in April 1945, Frankl returned to Vienna to discover that almost everyone he loved was dead. He was 39 years old, physically, destroyed, emotionally devastated. Yet within 9 days of his return, he began dictating the book that would make him internationally known. Published in 1946 in German, it would eventually be translated as Man's Search for Meaning, a slender volume combining memoir and philosophical reflection. The first half described his camp experiences with a clinical precision that somehow made them more, rather than less, moving. The second half outlined the principles of logotherapy, the meaning-centered approach to psychology that his experiences had crystallized. The book's central message was both simple and revolutionary. Those who have a why can bear almost any how. Meaning, Frankl argued, is not something we create arbitrarily or invent from nothing. Rather, it is something we discover or detect in the world. There are 3 primary ways humans find meaning. First, through creating something or doing a deed, through work, creativity, achievement. Second, through experiencing something or encountering someone through love, beauty, truth. Third, and most importantly, through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. When we cannot change our circumstances, we can still change ourselves. Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, whether that meaning is the fulfillment of a responsibility, the witness of suffering so that others might learn, or the opportunity to demonstrate grace under pressure. This third path to meaning through suffering distinguishes Frankl's approach from almost all other schools of psychology. Most therapeutic systems aim to reduce or eliminate suffering. Frankl acknowledged this goal, but went further. He argued that suffering, when unavoidable, is not merely something to be endured, but an opportunity for the deepest meaning-making. The person who can give their suffering meaning is transformed by it rather than destroyed. This was not masochism or glorification of pain. Frankl was clear that suffering that can be avoided should be avoided. But life inevitably includes suffering that cannot be avoided: loss, illness, aging, death. And in these unavoidable circumstances, our response becomes crucial. Frankl's vision of human nature was fundamentally optimistic without being naive. He believed humans are oriented toward meaning, always reaching out beyond themselves toward goals, values, and purposes. This self-transcendent quality means we are most human when we are absorbed in something beyond our own psychological states. Excessive self-reflection, paradoxically, can create neurosis. Frankl described cases of insomnia cured when patients stopped trying to sleep and focused on something else. Sexual dysfunction resolved when partners stopped focusing on performance and simply loved each other. This pattern he called paradoxical intention, the therapeutic use of the human capacity for self-detachment and humor. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Frankl developed his ideas further. He distinguished neurogenic neuroses, those arising from psychological conflicts, from noogenic neuroses, those arising from existential frustration and lack of meaning. He argued that modern society produced an existential vacuum, a widespread feeling of meaninglessness resulting from the loss of traditional values and the reduction of human beings to biological and psychological mechanisms. When people lack meaning, they seek to fill the void with pleasure-seeking or power-seeking or simple busyness. But none of these substitutes satisfies the deep hunger for purpose. Frankl's therapeutic method was directive in a way that contrasted sharply with classical psychoanalysis. He did not believe in extensive excavation of childhood trauma or unconscious complexes. He focused on the present and future, on helping patients discover or reconnect with meaning. His techniques included Socratic dialogue to help patients uncover their values, paradoxical intention to address performance anxiety and obsessive thoughts, and de-reflection to shift attention away from symptoms and toward meaningful engagement with the world. His approach was brief compared to psychoanalysis, practical and oriented toward action. Yet despite their differences, Frankl maintained respect for other approaches, including Jung's. He read widely in psychology, philosophy, and theology. He was familiar with existentialist philosophy, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, though he distinguished his approach from atheistic existentialism by affirming the objective existence of meaning, waiting to be discovered rather than subjectively created. He was deeply informed by his Jewish heritage, while remaining open to universal spiritual truths. He saw logotherapy not as a replacement for other therapies, but as a complement, addressing the specifically human dimension of existence, what he called the noological dimension, the realm of meaning and spirit. By the time Frankl died in 1997 at age 92, he had written over 30 books, given lectures around the world, taught at universities in Vienna and America, and seen logotherapy practiced on every continent. Man's Search for Meaning had sold millions of copies and been voted one of the most influential books of the 20th century. His ideas had influenced fields beyond psychology, philosophy, theology, education, business. Yet he remained in some ways a solitary figure, not easily categorized within mainstream psychology, which had largely moved toward behavioral and cognitive models that seemed to leave out the very dimension of meaning that Frankl insisted was most essential. Jung died in 1961, when Frankl was at the height of his influence. There is no record that they ever met. Jung spent most of his later years in Switzerland, focused on his writing and analytical practice. Frankl was building logotherapy in Vienna and, later through international lectures. They inhabited different professional worlds, worked in different languages, addressed somewhat different audiences. Jung's influence was strongest among Jungian analysts, scholars of religion and mythology, and those drawn to depth psychology's symbolic approach. Frankl's influence spread through psychiatric wards, counseling centers, and among those seeking practical guidance for living meaningfully. Yet their works address overlapping territory. Both men were concerned with the crisis of meaning in modern life. Both saw the reduction of human beings to purely biological or mechanistic terms as fundamentally inadequate. Both believed that healing required engaging with a dimension beyond the purely personal ego. Both saw suffering not merely as something to eliminate, but as potentially meaningful. Both were deeply influenced by their cultural moment, the breakdown of traditional certainties, the catastrophes of the 20th century, the search for new foundations for human dignity and purpose. The differences in their life experiences shaped their approaches profoundly. Jung's life, though marked by psychological crisis and the upheavals of 2 world wars, was relatively protected. He had the luxury of descending into his unconscious and emerging with insights. He could pursue alchemical studies, travel to explore other cultures, develop elaborate theoretical systems. His confrontation with the unconscious was voluntary, pursued in the safety of his own mind and home. Frankl's confrontation was involuntary, thrust upon him by historical forces of unspeakable brutality. Jung explored the depths. Frankl survived the depths. Jung's insights came through introspection and clinical work with neurotic patients. Frankl's insights came through the extremity of the camps, through witnessing what human beings become at the absolute limit of suffering. These different starting points led to different emphases. Jung looked inward and downward into the symbolic depths. Frankl looked outward and upward toward transcendent meaning. Jung trusted the unconscious, saw it as containing wisdom and guidance. Frankl trusted consciousness, the specifically human capacity for self-awareness and choice. Jung emphasized integration, bringing unconscious contents into awareness. Frankl emphasized transcendence, reaching beyond oneself toward goals and purposes. Jung's language was mythological, archetypal, imaginal. Frankl's language was existential, philosophical, practical, yet we should not overstate their differences. There are deep convergences as well, places where their different paths lead to surprisingly similar destinations. Both saw the human being as oriented towards something beyond immediate survival and pleasure. Both recognize that neurosis often has a spiritual dimension. Both believe that healing requires engaging with what matters most deeply to the individual. Both saw their work as addressing a specifically modern crisis, the loss of traditional frameworks of meaning in an increasingly secular, rationalized world. As we settle deeper into this exploration, let us hold both men in mind simultaneously. Imagine them in conversation, perhaps in some timeless space where ideas can meet unencumbered by the accidents of history. Jung, older, speaking in his measured Swiss-German accent, his eyes bright with the intensity of someone who has seen the inner worlds. Frankl, younger but aged beyond his years by suffering, speaking with the quiet authority of someone who has tested theories in the harshest laboratory. Between them, questions hover. What is meaning? Where does it come from? How do we find it or make it? What is the relationship between the depths of psyche and the heights of spirit? Can suffering be meaningful? Must it be? These questions form the heart of our inquiry. In the sections to come, we will explore how each man answered them, where their answers converge and diverge, and what their dialogue reveals about the perennial questions of human existence. But for now, simply rest in the knowledge that 2 great minds, shaped by different experiences and temperaments, dedicated their lives to understanding what makes human life worth living. In their different ways, both were guides to meaning, cartographers of the inner terrain where purpose is found or forged. Let us begin to trace the contours of their different maps of meaning, starting with their fundamental approaches to the mystery of human consciousness. When Jung looked at a human being, he saw a layered reality. On the surface was the persona, the mask we wear in social life, the role we play. Behind this was the ego, the center of conscious identity, the I that seems to be in charge. But Jung's great discovery was that the ego is not the whole of the personality, not even the center of the whole personality. Beneath or behind or surrounding the ego lies the personal unconscious, containing forgotten memories, repressed wishes, complexes formed by emotional experiences. And beneath this personal layer lies something even deeper, the collective unconscious, a transpersonal substrate shared by all humanity, structured by archetypes, those primordial patterns that give rise to universal images and experiences. This vision of psyche as layered depth gave Jung a particular approach to meaning. Meaning, for Jung, emerges from the conversation between ego and self. The self is the archetype of wholeness, the totality of the personality, the organizing center that the ego serves whether it knows it or not. Throughout life, the self sends messages to the ego through dreams, symptoms, synchronicities, and spontaneous fantasies. These messages are expressed in symbolic language, the language of myth, fairy tale, and religious imagery. When the ego learns to attend to these messages, to engage in what Jung called active imagination, a kind of dialogue between conscious and unconscious ensues. This dialogue is the process of individuation, the gradual realization of one's unique potential, the journey toward wholeness. Meaning, in this framework, is not primarily something we consciously decide upon. Rather, it is something the psyche already knows and gradually reveals to consciousness. The acorn contains the pattern of the oak. The self contains the blueprint of who we are meant to become. Neurosis results when the ego's conscious intentions conflict with the self's deeper trajectory. A person may consciously believe they want one thing, while unconsciously being guided toward something else. The symptom or dream or crisis comes as a corrective, demanding that consciousness adjust to the larger wisdom of the psyche. Jung's approach to meaning was thus profoundly trusting of the unconscious. He saw the psyche as possessing inherent intelligence, a self-regulating capacity, a tendency toward wholeness. His therapeutic approach involved helping patients learn to read the symbolic language of their own depths. A recurring dream of descending stairs might symbolize the need to go deeper into oneself. A figure of a wise old man appearing in dreams might represent the archetype of the wise elder, offering guidance. A series of synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences, might suggest that the psyche is trying to communicate something important. This approach had profound implications for how Jung understood suffering. Physical and psychological symptoms were not merely problems to be eliminated, but messages to be understood. A woman's migraine might symbolize a conflict she cannot consciously acknowledge. A man's impotence might reflect his unconscious rejection of a persona-driven, power-seeking life. The symptom says, "Pay attention. Something is wrong with how you are living. You need to expand your consciousness to include what you've been leaving out." Neurosis was the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. As Jung put it, the cure came not through symptom removal, but through meaning discovery, through expanding consciousness to include the rejected, repressed, or simply unknown parts of oneself. Jung's vision was deeply mythological. He saw individual lives as recapitulations of eternal patterns. The hero's journey, described in countless myths, mirrors the individual's journey towards self-realization. The alchemical transformation of base metal into gold symbolizes the psychological transformation of consciousness. The mandala, appearing spontaneously in dreams and art across cultures, represents the self, the archetype of wholeness. These mythological patterns were not mere metaphors for Jung, but living realities, archetypal forces that shape individual lives. To understand oneself meant to understand which myths one was living, which archetypes were active in one's psyche. This gave Jung's concept of meaning a particular quality. Meaning was archetypal, rooted in the collective unconscious, connected to universal patterns. When someone found their calling, it was because they had connected with an archetypal pattern: the healer, the teacher, the warrior, the sage. When someone's life felt meaningful, it was because they were aligned with the self's trajectory, living in accordance with their deeper nature. The task was not to create meaning from nothing, but to discover the meaning that the psyche already contained. Jung's method required a certain kind of relationship with the unconscious. He practiced active imagination, a technique of deliberate engagement with inner figures and images. He would visualize a dream figure and enter into conversation with it, allowing it to respond with a life of its own. He filled notebooks with these dialogues, painted and carved the images that arose, treated them as real presences with whom he was in relationship. This was not passive fantasy, but active engagement with the autonomous contents of the psyche. Through this practice, Jung believed, one could gradually integrate unconscious material, expand consciousness, and move toward wholeness. The goal of Jungian analysis was individuation, the process of becoming oneself, of realizing one's unique pattern, of integrating the various aspects of personality into a coherent whole. This was a lifelong process, never fully completed, involving the gradual expansion of consciousness to include more of the psyche's totality. It required confronting the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we reject or deny. It required integrating the anima or animus, the contrasexual elements of the psyche. It required relativizing the ego, recognizing that the conscious I is not the center of the personality, but serves a larger center, the self. And it required finding one's personal myth, the narrative that gives coherence and meaning to one's particular life. Jung's approach was not, however, purely inward. He recognized that meaning also involved relationship with the outer world. But the outer world, in Jung's view, was meaningful precisely to the extent that it resonated with inner archetypal patterns. One chose a vocation not merely for practical reasons, but because it allowed expression of an archetypal image, the physician as healer, the teacher as wise elder, the artist as creator. One fell in love not merely because of the other person's qualities, but because they carried the projection of one's anima or animus. Even apparently external events could be meaningful through synchronicity, a causal connecting principle that linked inner psychic states with outer events in ways that transcended mechanical causality. This leads to a crucial point about Jung's understanding of suffering. He did not see suffering as intrinsically meaningful. Rather, he saw it as a signal, a symptom, an indication that something is out of balance in the psyche. Suffering meant that the ego's attitude was one-sided, that some aspect of the personality was being repressed, that consciousness needed to expand. The meaning of suffering was psychological. It pointed toward what needed to be integrated. The person who suffered from depression might need to integrate their shadow to acknowledge rejected aspects of themselves. The person who suffered from anxiety might need to confront an unlived life, a calling not answered. The suffering itself was not the goal, but the catalyst for psychological transformation. Jung's worldview was ultimately optimistic about the psyche's inherent tendency toward healing. He believed that if one engaged sincerely with the unconscious, attended to dreams, practiced active imagination, and worked toward integration, the psyche would reveal its own path toward wholeness. The analyst's role was to facilitate this process, not to direct it. Each person's individuation was unique, their personal myth distinct. The analyst could not know in advance what wholeness looked like for this particular individual. One could only trust the psyche's own wisdom, its own teleological drive toward realization. This trust in the unconscious distinguished Jung from Freud, who saw the unconscious as primarily a repository of dangerous, repressed wishes that needed to be controlled by the rational ego. For Jung, the unconscious was not merely personal but collective, not merely dark but containing light, not merely regressive but also progressive, pointing toward future development. Dreams were not merely wish fulfillments but also anticipatory, showing possible futures, offering guidance. The unconscious was not the enemy of consciousness but its partner in the journey toward wholeness. Now, let us turn to Frankl's vision, which begins from a very different vantage point. When Frankl looked at a human being, he saw first and foremost a creature oriented toward meaning. This orientation was not a secondary need, not something that emerges after biological needs are met, but the primary motivational force in human life. Frankl called this the will to meaning, distinguishing it from Freud's will to pleasure and Adler's will to power. While pleasure and power might be pursued as means to meaning, they cannot substitute for it. A life devoted solely to pleasure becomes empty. A life devoted solely to power becomes brutal. Only a life oriented toward meaning satisfies the specifically human hunger for purpose. But what is meaning, in Frankl's view? This question is central. Meaning is not a subjective feeling, not something we project onto a neutral reality. Rather, meaning is objective, waiting to be discovered in each situation. Every moment presents a question. What does this situation demand of me? What is the meaning inherent in this particular circumstance? The human task is to detect or discover this meaning, and then to actualize it through action. We do not invent meaning arbitrarily. We find it by attending carefully to the unique demands of each situation. This gives Frankl's approach a quality very different from Jung's. Where Jung looks inward and downward into the symbolic depths, Frankl looks outward toward the world and upward toward transcendent values. Meaning is not primarily found in the unconscious, but in the world, in concrete situations, in the values we serve and the people we love. Consciousness, not the unconscious, is the distinctively human capacity, our ability to stand back from ourselves, to reflect, to choose our attitude. This is what makes us human. The unconscious may play a role, but it is consciousness, especially what Frankl calls the spiritual unconscious, that is the primary locus of meaning. Frankl distinguished 3 dimensions of human existence. The somatic dimension includes our biological, bodily existence. The psychological dimension includes our thoughts, emotions, and mental processes. But most important is the noological dimension, from the Greek nous, meaning spirit or mind. This is the specifically human dimension, the realm of meaning, values, and purposes. Classical psychology, Frankl argued, tends to reduce human beings to the somatic and psychological dimensions, treating us as complex animals. But this misses what is essential about being human: our capacity for self-transcendence, our orientation beyond ourselves toward goals and values. Self-transcendence is the key concept. For Frankl, we are most human when we are absorbed in something beyond ourselves. The artist lost in creation, the lover absorbed in the beloved, the scientist pursuing truth, the activist serving a cause. These exemplify authentic human existence. Excessive self-reflection, by contrast, creates neurosis. The person who constantly monitors their own happiness becomes unhappy. The person who obsesses about their performance becomes dysfunctional. Frankl observed this pattern clinically and developed techniques based on it. Paradoxical intention instructs patients to intend the very thing they fear, which breaks the anxious self-monitoring that perpetuates symptoms. Dereflection redirects attention away from symptoms and toward meaningful engagement with the world. These techniques reflect Frankl's fundamental conviction that we find ourselves by losing ourselves in something meaningful. This is not passive submission, but active commitment. We choose what to commit to, what values to serve, what purposes to pursue. This element of choice is crucial. We cannot control what happens to us, but we can always control how we respond. This last freedom, the freedom to choose one's attitude, remains even in the most constrained circumstances. It was this freedom that Frankl observed in the concentration camps, the irreducible human capacity to choose one's inner stance even when all outer freedom is removed. The camps taught Frankl that suffering can be meaningful. Not that suffering is good or should be sought, but that when it is unavoidable, our response to it becomes crucial. He observed that prisoners who had a why to live for were more likely to survive. Those who had someone waiting for them, some work to complete, some testimony to bear, these prisoners found resources to endure. Those who lost all sense of purpose often died not from the physical hardships alone, but from giving up, from the loss of hope and meaning. Frankl himself clung to several sources of meaning: his unfinished manuscript on logotherapy, his love for his wife, his determination to learn from and witness the camp experience. These gave him a reason to survive. From these observations, Frankl developed his understanding of tragic optimism. He refused to deny the reality of suffering, guilt, and death, what he called the tragic triad. These are inescapable aspects of human existence. But even in the face of this tragic triad, optimism remains possible, not naive optimism that denies suffering, but tragic optimism that transforms suffering by giving it meaning. The suffering that can be given meaning ceases to be mere suffering and becomes sacrifice, testimony, transformation. The guilt that can be acknowledged becomes an opportunity for change. The transitoriness of life gives urgency to the present moment, making our choices and actions irreversible and therefore significant. Frankl's therapeutic method reflects this philosophy. Logotherapy is not focused on excavating the past or analyzing unconscious conflicts. It is oriented toward the future, toward helping patients discover or recover meaning. The logotherapist asks, "What does your life ask of you? What unique contribution are you positioned to make? What responsibilities are calling you? What loves sustain you? What suffering might you transform by giving it meaning?" These questions redirect attention from symptoms to purposes, from problems to possibilities. 3 primary paths to meaning emerge in Frankl's thought. First, we find meaning through creative values. through what we give to the world: work, art, achievement, contribution. These provide meaning by allowing us to actualize our potential and offer something of value. This path emphasizes our capacity to create, to shape the world according to our values and visions. Second, we find meaning through experiential values, through what we receive from the world: love, beauty, truth, goodness. These provide meaning through our capacity to be moved, touched, transformed by encounter with what is valuable. This path emphasizes receptivity, openness, the capacity to be affected by what transcends us. Frankl wrote movingly about love as the deepest source of meaning, the encounter with another person in their uniqueness and worth. Third, and most distinctively, we find meaning through attitudinal values, through the stance we take toward unavoidable suffering. When we can no longer change our circumstances, we can still change ourselves. The attitude we take toward our suffering, the meaning we give it, transforms both the suffering and ourselves. This path is available even when the other two are blocked, which is why Frankl saw it as the most profound. Even when we can no longer create or experience, we can still choose our attitude, and in that choice lies meaning and dignity. This third path distinguishes Frankl most sharply from conventional psychology and from Jung. Where traditional therapy aims to reduce suffering, Frankl argues that suffering, when unavoidable, is an opportunity for the deepest meaning-making. Where Jung sees suffering as a signal of psychic imbalance, Frankl sees it as potentially meaningful in itself, not merely as pointing toward something else. The person who suffers from terminal illness cannot fix the situation, but they can choose how to face it with despair or with grace, with bitterness or with acceptance, with meaninglessness or with the meaning of bearing witness to human dignity in extremity. Frankl's vision of human nature is thus fundamentally oriented toward transcendence. We are always reaching beyond ourselves toward goals, values, and purposes. We exist in relationship with other people, with our work, with values we serve, with meanings we detect in situations. We are not primarily driven by unconscious forces or instinctual needs, but called by meanings and values that transcend us. The person is not driven from behind by causes, but drawn forward by reasons. This teleological, rather than causal view, means that explanation is not enough. We need understanding of intentions, purposes, and meanings. Frankl was critical of what he called reductionism, the tendency to explain human phenomena in terms of lower levels. Psychological reductionism explains meaning in terms of psychological needs. Biological reductionism explains consciousness in terms of brain mechanisms. But Frankl argued that human phenomena can only be understood at the human level, in terms of meanings, values, and purposes. To explain love as merely a biochemical process or a psychological need misses what is essential about love, its intentional quality, its directedness toward another person and their unique, irreplaceable worth. To explain artistic creation as sublimated instinct misses the creative act's orientation toward beauty and truth. This anti-reductionist stance led Frankl to critique psychologism, the tendency to reduce spiritual questions to psychological problems. When someone asks about the meaning of life, this is not necessarily a symptom of neurosis. It might be a genuine philosophical question, what Frankl called a neogenic question. The answer is not therapeutic intervention, but philosophical dialogue, helping the person think through their question. Similarly, Existential frustration, the feeling that life lacks meaning, is not necessarily pathological. It might be an appropriate response to a genuinely meaningless situation or lifestyle. The cure is not therapy, but reorientation toward meaning. Yet Frankl did not dismiss the unconscious entirely. He distinguished between the instinctual unconscious, which Freud emphasized, and the spiritual unconscious, the realm of conscience, love, and repressed meaning. This spiritual unconscious is the source of our deepest values and commitments. Conscience is the organ that detects meaning, the inner sense that tells us what this situation demands. When conscience is functioning well, it operates unconsciously, spontaneously guiding us toward right action. Problems arise when conscience is suppressed or when we lose contact with our spiritual unconscious. Frankl also acknowledged the role of the unconscious in creativity. The artist does not consciously construct every element of a work. Something rises from the unconscious. The scientist's breakthrough often comes as sudden insight, not logical deduction. But even here, Frankl emphasized that what emerges from the unconscious is meaningful, not merely symbolic in Jung's sense. The creative unconscious serves conscious purposes and values. It is not autonomous, but integrated into the person's orientation toward meaning. This brings us to a crucial difference. For Jung, individuation involves relativizing the ego, recognizing that consciousness serves the larger self. The ego learns humility before the unconscious. For Frankl, the goal is not ego reduction, but ego strengthening, developing the capacity for responsible choice, for standing back from conditioning and consciously deciding one's stance. The weak ego cannot find meaning because it cannot choose freely. The strong ego can take responsibility, can say yes to life despite suffering, can commit to purposes beyond personal gratification. Frankl was also less interested than Jung in mythological and archetypal patterns. Where Jung saw individual lives as recapitulations of eternal myths, Frankl emphasized the uniqueness of each person's situation. There is no general answer to the question of life's meaning. Each person must discover their unique meaning, the specific task or responsibility that life presents to them. One cannot live by borrowed meanings or follow a predetermined pattern. The call is always individual, unique, irreplaceable. This emphasis on uniqueness extended to Frankl's view of death. For Jung, death was a transition, the psyche perhaps continuing in some form, participation in the eternal patterns of the collective unconscious. For Frankl, death's certainty gives life urgency and meaning. Because we will die, our choices are irreversible, our actions significant. Each moment, once past, is preserved eternally in the past. Nothing we have done can be undone, which means that realized meanings are permanent achievements. The transitoriness of life does not diminish meaning but intensifies it. We must act now, because this moment will not come again. Yet despite these differences, there are deep affinities between Frankl's and Jung's projects. Both recognize that the modern crisis is fundamentally a crisis of meaning. The loss of traditional religious frameworks, the rise of scientific materialism, the reduction of human beings to biological and economic functions, these leave people feeling hollow, purposeless, disconnected from what matters. Both Jung's individuation and Frankl's will to meaning address this crisis by affirming that human life has inherent purpose and significance. Both also recognized that this purpose cannot be imposed from outside. It must be discovered or realized through inner work. For Jung, this inner work involves dialogue with the unconscious. For Frankl, it involves clarification of values and responsibilities through reflection and conscience. But both require an inward turn, a questioning of unexamined assumptions, a willingness to face difficult truths about oneself. Both men also saw their work as addressing not just neurotic individuals, but cultural pathology. Jung diagnosed modern society as suffering from loss of symbolic connection to the archetypal depths, resulting in one-sided rationalism, materialism, and the shadow projection that fueled 2 world wars. Frankl diagnosed modern society as suffering from existential vacuum, a widespread feeling of meaninglessness resulting from the loss of traditional values and the rise of conformism and collectivism. Both saw their therapeutic approaches as having implications beyond the consulting room, offering paths forward for a civilization in crisis. And both, finally, maintained a certain humility about the limits of their knowledge. Jung insisted that he could not prove the existence of the collective unconscious or archetypes with scientific certainty. These were models that seemed to fit the data, useful fictions or empirical realities depending on one's epistemological stance. Frankl acknowledged that ultimate meaning, the meaning of the whole of existence, might remain beyond human comprehension. We can find meaning in our particular lives and situations, but the cosmic question of why there is something rather than nothing might exceed our capacity to answer. Both men's work rested on a kind of pragmatic faith that meaning exists and can be found, tested through experience rather than proven in advance. Now, let us explore their contrasts and convergences more deeply by examining specific cases and concepts, imagining how each might have approached the same situations. Consider a case that might present in either a Jungian or logotherapeutic context. A woman in her mid-40s comes to therapy reporting a deep sense of emptiness. She has a successful career, a stable marriage, healthy children. By external measures, her life is enviable. Yet she feels hollow, as if going through motions, wondering what it's all for. She has difficulty sleeping, no longer finds pleasure in activities she once enjoyed, feels disconnected from her own life. She says she wakes up asking, "Is this all there is?" How would Jung approach this case? He would likely see the emptiness as a sign that the ego's conscious program is too narrow, that unlived life is demanding recognition. Her successful career and stable marriage represent her persona, the mask she shows the world, but they do not encompass the totality of who she is. The emptiness is the voice of the self, calling for individuation, for expansion of consciousness to include disowned aspects of personality. Jung would inquire about her dreams. Perhaps she dreams of abandoned houses, suggesting forgotten or neglected parts of herself. Perhaps a wild animal appears, representing instinctual energies that her civilized life has repressed. Perhaps she dreams of dying or descending underground, images of necessary dissolution before renewal. These dream images would provide clues to what the unconscious is trying to communicate. He would also explore her life history. Perhaps she chose her career to please her parents, achieving success by their standards while ignoring her own deeper inclinations. Perhaps in becoming a competent professional and responsible mother, she abandoned creative or spiritual aspirations she once had. Perhaps she has over-identified with the persona of the successful woman, leaving out shadow elements her capacity for wildness, solitude, spirituality, or artistic expression. The Jungian approach would involve amplification of whatever images emerge. If she dreams of an abandoned garden, Jung would explore mythological and literary images of gardens: the Garden of Eden, the secret garden, the alchemical garden, looking for resonances that connect her personal experience to archetypal patterns. He would help her see that her emptiness is not personal failure, but a universal experience described in myths and fairy tales. The moment when the hero must leave the familiar world and venture into unknown territory. He might introduce active imagination, asking her to visualize the garden from her dream and enter into it imaginatively, seeing what she finds there, perhaps encountering a figure who has guidance to offer. Through this practice, she would learn to dialogue with the unconscious, to receive its messages, to gradually integrate what has been left out of her conscious life. The goal would be individuation, helping her discover who she authentically is beyond her roles and achievements. Perhaps she needs to develop her inferior function, the least conscious aspect of her psychological type. Perhaps she needs to encounter her animus, the masculine element in her psyche that might be stronger or different than her conscious identity allows. Perhaps she needs to find her personal myth, the narrative that gives coherence to her unique life journey. Jung would trust the process, believing that if she engages sincerely with her unconscious, it will reveal what she needs. The emptiness itself is meaningful, a necessary stage in transformation. She must experience the death of the old identity before the new one can emerge. The suffering serves a purpose in the larger pattern of individuation. Now, consider how Frankl would approach this same woman. He would likely diagnose her condition as neurogenic neurosis, arising not from psychological conflicts but from existential frustration. She has achieved success by conventional standards, but has not found authentic meaning. She is suffering from what Frankl called provisional existence, living as if her real life is always about to begin, rather than recognizing that it is happening now. Frankl would not focus on dreams or the unconscious. Instead, he would engage in Socratic dialogue, asking questions designed to help her clarify her values and responsibilities. What matters most to you? When do you feel most alive? What do you care about deeply enough that you would sacrifice for it? If you knew you had 1 year to live, what would you do differently? What does your life ask of you? He would help her distinguish between success and meaning. Success can be measured externally: career advancement, financial security, social status, but meaning is internal. The felt sense that one's life matters, that one is fulfilling responsibilities and actualizing values. She may have achieved success without finding meaning, which is precisely her problem. Frankl would challenge her self-preoccupation. Her emptiness results partly from excessive self-reflection, from monitoring her own happiness rather than engaging with the world. He would encourage dereflection, shifting attention away from her internal state and toward what she can contribute. What needs doing in her world? What calls to her? Where might she make a difference? He might explore whether she has confused means with ends. Perhaps she pursued her career as a means to financial security, which was itself a means to family stability, which was itself a means to happiness. But in this chain of means to ends, she has lost touch with ultimate values, with what is worth pursuing for its own sake. What does she love? What truths does she seek? What beauty moves her? What injustices stir her conscience? Frankl would emphasize her freedom and responsibility. She is not merely the product of her past or her circumstances. At every moment, she can choose her attitude and actions. The question is not why she feels empty, but rather what she will do about it. How will she respond to this crisis? Will she see it as mere depression to be medicated away, or as a wake-up call, an opportunity to reorient her life toward authentic meaning? He might also explore attitudinal values. Perhaps her sense of emptiness itself can be meaningful. Perhaps she is meant to learn something through this dark period: patience, humility, compassion for others who suffer similarly. Perhaps her testimony about this experience will help others. Suffering that finds. Meaning ceases to be merely suffering and becomes transformation. The goal would be helping her discover or recover her will to meaning, helping her detect the unique responsibilities that life presents to her. This is not a matter of following an archetypal pattern, but of responding to her irreplaceable situation. What is the meaning that this life, this moment, this situation demands of her specifically? Notice the contrasts. Jung looks inward to the unconscious. Frankl looks outward to the world. Jung seeks to expand consciousness through integration of unconscious contents. Frankl seeks to focus consciousness on meaningful engagement with tasks and values. Jung amplifies images. Frankl asks questions. Jung trusts the unconscious to reveal what is needed. Frankl trusts conscious reflection and choice. Jung sees the suffering as meaningful because it points toward needed integration. Frankl sees the suffering as potentially meaningful if she chooses to transform it through attitudinal change. Yet both would take her seriously. Neither would simply prescribe medication to mask symptoms. Both would recognize that her crisis is fundamentally spiritual or existential rather than merely biological. Both would see it as an opportunity for growth rather than mere pathology. And both would help her move from a conventional, unreflective life toward a more authentic, individually realized existence. Consider another example: a man who lost his wife suddenly and is paralyzed by grief. He cannot work, cannot eat, sees no reason to continue. He comes to therapy at his children's insistence, but he says life without his wife is meaningless. Jung would recognize this as more than personal loss. The wife was likely carrying his anima projection. She embodied his own unconscious feminine qualities, his capacity for relatedness and feeling. Her death means he must now integrate what she represented. His grief is so overwhelming because he has lost not just an external person, but a connection to a part of himself. Jung would work with whatever images arise. Perhaps the man dreams of his wife, which Jung would see not as wishful thinking but as the psyche working through the loss. Perhaps transforming the wife image into something else, an inner guide, a connection to the eternal feminine. Perhaps archetypal images of death and rebirth appear: the descent to the underworld, the winter that precedes spring. Jung would help him see his loss as part of the eternal pattern of transformation, not to minimize the personal pain, but to connect it to something larger. Jung might explore the synchronistic aspects of the death. Why did it happen when it did? What inner change might it be constellating? This is not to suggest the death was meant to be, or that it serves some cosmic purpose, but to explore whether the psyche's own development is involved in how the event is experienced and integrated. The Jungian aim would be helping him integrate the qualities his wife embodied so that he carries them within himself rather than projecting them outward. His grief would gradually transform as he develops his own capacity for the relatedness and feeling that his wife once provided. The lost external relationship would become internalized as a relationship with his own anima. In time, he might even feel gratitude for what the marriage gave him, including this painful initiation into a deeper level of being. Frankl would approach this differently. He would not rush the man's grief. Grief is the appropriate response to loss. It honors the significance of the relationship. But at some point, Frankl would ask, what does your wife's life and your love for her demand of you now? If your love was genuine, what does it ask of you in her absence? Perhaps it asks that he live in a way that honors her memory. Perhaps it asks that he complete projects she cared about. Perhaps it asks that he be present for their children who also grieve. Perhaps it asks that he bear witness to the reality that love transcends death, that his love for her continues even though she is gone, which proves that love is a spiritual act, not merely a biological or psychological phenomenon. Frankl might share his own experience. He lost his wife in the camps, learned later that she had died. In his darkest moments, he thought of her, imagined conversations with her, found meaning in his love for her that persisted despite her absence. The love itself became a source of meaning, a reason to survive, and to testify to the reality of love's transcendence. The logotherapeutic question would be, can you transform your suffering by giving it meaning? Can your grief become testimony to the depth of your love? Can your loss become an occasion to demonstrate what it means to love faithfully even beyond death? This is not consolation that minimizes loss, but an invitation to see that how one bears loss is itself meaningful. Frankl would also explore what else gives the man's life meaning. He has children who need him. He has responsibilities that persist. He has perhaps a work that only he can do, a contribution that only he can make. While nothing replaces his wife, life continues to present opportunities for meaning through creative and attitudinal values, even when experiential values are lost. Again, we see the contrast. Jung helps the man integrate the loss psychologically, transforming the external relationship into internal development. Frankl helps the man find meaning in his response to the loss, transforming suffering into spiritual achievement. Jung focuses on individuation. Frankl focuses on transcendence. Yet both help the man move from paralysis to renewed engagement with life, recognizing that the loss is real and painful but not the end of meaning. Let us explore one more case. A young person struggling with the question of vocation. They have many interests and abilities but cannot choose a path. Every option seems equally good and equally unsatisfying. They feel paralyzed, unable to commit, worried they will make the wrong choice and waste their life. Jung would see this as potentially a problem of type and attitude. Perhaps the young person has not yet differentiated their functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. They might be an intuitive type, overwhelmed by possibilities, unable to settle on the concrete particular. Or they might be too identified with thinking, evaluating options rationally without consulting feeling values that would tell them what they truly care about. Jung would explore their dreams and fantasies. What do they imagine themselves doing? What attracts them? These imaginative explorations contain clues to their individual nature, their personal myth. Perhaps recurring dream images point toward their vocation. If they dream repeatedly of healing or helping, perhaps a helping profession calls to them. If they dream of building or constructing, perhaps engineering or craftsmanship. Jung would also consider archetypal patterns. Perhaps this young person is in what Joseph Campbell called the refusal of the call, the hero's initial resistance to the adventure. They know at some level what they should do, but fear it, doubt themselves, look for easier paths. The paralysis is not lack of knowing, but fear of following where the self leads. The Jungian approach would involve helping them listen to the unconscious, trusting that the psyche already knows their path. They cannot figure it out rationally. They must discover it through attending to dreams, fantasies, synchronicities, the subtle movements of energy and interest that indicate alignment with the self's trajectory. Their task is not to choose correctly by external criteria, but to find what is authentically theirs, their unique expression of an archetypal pattern. Frankl would approach this situation quite differently. He would question the premise that one must find the perfect vocation that will make life meaningful. This gets it backwards. Meaning is not in the vocation, but in what one does with it. Any honest work can be meaningful if one approaches it with the right attitude and orientation. The young person is procrastinating through over-reflection, waiting for a guarantee that does not exist. Frankl would emphasize that meaning is found in concrete situations, not abstract possibilities. Stop contemplating options and engage with the world. Try something. Commit to something. Meaning emerges through action, not contemplation. The paralysis comes from wanting certainty before acting, but life does not work that way. We must act into uncertainty, and meaning reveals itself through our engagement. He might say, "What does this moment demand of you?" Not what career should you choose for the next 40 years, but what is the next right step? What responsibility is calling you right now? Perhaps the responsibility is to stop burdening your parents with your indecision. Perhaps it is to commit to something for a year and see what you learn. Perhaps it is to volunteer somewhere and discover what needs doing in the world. Frankl would also challenge the assumption that vocation is primarily about self-fulfillment. This is narcissistic, a symptom of our therapeutic culture's obsession with self-actualization. Vocation should be about contribution. What can you give to the world, not what can you get from your career. When you shift from self-preoccupation to world engagement, the question becomes easier. What needs doing that you could do? Where might you make a difference? He might point out that the greatest achievers often did not agonize over choices, but responded to needs they encountered. Frankl himself did not set out to found logotherapy. He was responding to the suicidal patients he encountered, then to his own experiences in the camps. The work found him through his engagement with life's demands. If the young person commits to something and engages fully, their path will unfold. Meaning is discovered through action, not decided in advance. Once more, the contrast. Jung seeks the inner alignment with the self's calling, trusts the unconscious to reveal the path. Frankl emphasizes conscious choice, responsibility, engagement with concrete situations. Jung looks for symbolic indicators. Frankl looks for practical opportunities. Jung trusts inner process. Frankl emphasizes outer engagement. Yet both would agree that the young person's paralysis comes from avoidance of commitment, from fear of choosing wrongly, from demanding guarantees that life cannot provide. Both would encourage them to stop overthinking and to engage more directly with life. Both would see their struggle as potentially meaningful, an initiation into authentic choice rather than mere conformity or drift. These cases illuminate something important about the relationship between Jung's and Frankl's approaches. They are not necessarily contradictory, but complementary, addressing different dimensions of human existence. Jung addresses the psychological dimension, the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, the process of integrating rejected or unknown aspects of self. Frankl addresses the noological dimension, the realm of meaning, values, and responsibilities that transcend the purely psychological. A person might need both. They might need Jung's help in understanding the symbolic language of their dreams and symptoms, in integrating shadow and anima, in discovering their personal myth, and they might need Frankl's help in clarifying their values, taking responsibility for their choices, and orienting their life toward meaningful engagement with the world. The two approaches address different aspects of the human condition. This complementarity becomes clearer when we examine their respective strengths and limitations. Jung's approach excels at addressing the inner world, the symbolic dimension, the realm of image and imagination. For people who are cut off from their own depths, overly rational or extroverted, identified with persona and role, Jungian analysis can be profoundly liberating. It reconnects them with the mythic dimension of existence, with the archetypal patterns that give resonance and depth to individual life. It helps them see that their struggles are not merely personal failures, but participation in universal human dramas. But Jungian analysis can also become too focused on the inner world, too withdrawn from concrete engagement with life's demands. There is a risk of what Frankl would call hyper-reflection, excessive self-analysis that becomes its own obstacle. The person becomes endlessly fascinated with their own dreams and complexes, discussing them in analysis for years, without necessarily changing how they live or what they contribute to the world. The symbolic dimension can become an escape from rather than enhancement of lived engagement. Frankl's approach excels at addressing the existential dimension, the realm of choice, responsibility, and meaning in concrete situations. For people who are lost in navel-gazing, paralyzed by overanalysis, waiting for perfect clarity before acting, logotherapy can be a bracing wake-up call. It redirects attention from inner states to outer tasks, from problems to purposes, from symptoms to meanings. It challenges people to take responsibility, to act despite uncertainty, to find meaning through engagement with what calls to them. But logotherapy can also underemphasize the psychological dimension, the role of unconscious conflicts and childhood patterns in shaping present difficulties. Sometimes people cannot simply choose a better attitude. They need to work through psychological obstacles first. The person who is severely depressed may need therapy that addresses their psychological dynamics before they can meaningfully engage with questions of purpose. The person, shaped by trauma, may need psychological healing before they can freely choose. Perhaps the ideal integration would use both approaches, sequenced appropriately. Some people need Jungian depth work first, to reconnect with their own depths, to integrate split-off aspects of themselves, to find their personal myth. Then they need Franklian existential clarity, to take that psychological integration out into the world through meaningful action and commitment. Other people need the reverse sequence first, to break through paralysis and over-reflection through decisive commitment to meaningful action, then to deepen that engagement through psychological and symbolic work that gives it greater resonance and connection to archetypal patterns. The key is recognizing that both dimensions are real and important, the psychological and the neurological, the unconscious and the conscious, the symbolic and the existential, the inward and the outward. These are not contradictions, but complementary aspects of the full human reality. Jung and Frankl each specialized in one dimension, developed methods appropriate to it, and therefore have different strengths and limitations. We might even say that their different emphases reflect their different life situations. Jung, living in relative safety and stability, had the luxury of deep introspection, of descending into the unconscious and emerging with symbolic insights. His voluntarily chosen confrontation with the unconscious was possible because his external circumstances were secure. Frankl, thrust into extremity by historical catastrophe, could not afford extended introspection. He needed to find meaning immediately, in concrete situations, through conscious choices about attitude and response. The camps demanded not symbolic integration but existential strength, not psychological depth but spiritual transcendence. Yet this does not make either approach merely subjective or contingent. Each discovered something true and important about the human condition. Jung discovered that we have depths, that meaning emerges from engagement with the unconscious, that symbolic life nourishes the soul, that individuation is a real and important process. Frankl discovered that we have heights, that meaning is discovered in response to life's demands, that conscious choice remains even in extremity, that self-transcendence is essential to human fulfillment. Both discoveries are valid, both are needed, both reveal aspects of our nature. Consider their views on suffering more carefully, as this is where some of their most interesting differences emerge. For Jung, suffering is primarily symptomatic. It signals that something is wrong in the economy of the psyche. The symptom says, pay attention. Consciousness needs to expand. Some aspect of the personality is being repressed or neglected. Physical symptoms can have psychological meanings. The migraine that expresses a conflict the person cannot consciously acknowledge, the fatigue that results from living a life misaligned with the self. Psychological symptoms like anxiety and depression similarly point towards psychic imbalance. The neurotic person is suffering from an unlived life, from one-sidedness, from refusing the call to individuation. In this framework, suffering is instrumental. It serves the purpose of getting attention, of forcing consciousness to confront what it has been avoiding. When the suffering is attended to, when its symbolic message is understood and integrated, it can resolve. The woman with migraines might discover that they cease when she acknowledges and expresses anger she has been suppressing. The man with anxiety might find relief when he confronts the life changes he has been avoiding. The suffering itself is not the goal, but the catalyst for transformation. Jung did recognize that some suffering is unavoidable loss, aging, death. But even here, his emphasis was on the psychological work of integration. The person who loses a loved one must work through grief, must gradually internalize what the lost person represented, must transform the external relationship into an internal one. The person facing death must confront their own mortality, must perhaps achieve a deeper relationship with the self that transcends the ego's dissolution. Even unavoidable suffering calls for psychological work. This means Jung's view of suffering is ultimately optimistic in a certain sense. Suffering has purpose within the larger pattern of individuation. It is not meaningless or absurd. It points toward growth, toward needed changes, toward the self's trajectory. One can trust that if one engages with the suffering, understands its symbolic message, does the work it demands, transformation will occur. The psyche has its own wisdom, its own healing capacity, its own teleological drive toward wholeness. Frankl's view is both similar and different. He agreed that suffering can be meaningful, but not primarily because it points toward psychological integration. Suffering is meaningful when it is unavoidable and when we choose to transform it through our attitude toward it. The meaning is not in the suffering itself. Suffering is not good, not to be sought, but in our response to it. When we cannot change our circumstances, we can still change ourselves. The choice of attitude, the decision about how to bear what must be borne, this is where meaning emerges. Frankl was clear that suffering that can be avoided should be avoided. There is no virtue in unnecessary suffering. If your suffering results from a bad relationship, leave the relationship. If it results from an unfulfilling job, change the job. If it results from a psychological conflict, resolve the conflict. Suffering is not valuable in itself, but life inevitably includes suffering that cannot be avoided: terminal illness, irreversible loss, the tragic triad of suffering, guilt, and death. In these circumstances, attitudinal values become paramount. The camps were Frankl's proof of this principle. Here was suffering that could not be avoided, that no psychological integration or symbolic understanding would resolve. The practical question was, how does one survive psychologically in circumstances designed to destroy human dignity? And the answer was, by choosing one's attitude, by finding meaning even here, by exercising the last freedom of choosing one's inner stance. Frankl saw that some prisoners maintained their humanity while others degenerated. The difference was not primarily psychological but spiritual, a matter of whether they held on to meaning or lost it. Those who had a reason to survive, a task to complete, a testimony to bear, a love that endured despite separation, these prisoners found resources to resist the dehumanizing conditions. They demonstrated that human dignity is not given by external circumstances, but by inner freedom. This means Frankl's view of suffering is existential rather than psychological. Suffering does not necessarily point toward needed integration. It might just be suffering meaningless in itself, but potentially transformed by the attitude we take toward it. A person with terminal cancer does not need to integrate psychological contents or expand consciousness. They need to find meaning in how they face death, to bear witness to human dignity in extremity, to demonstrate grace under pressure. Their suffering becomes meaningful not through symbolic understanding, but through attitudinal choice. Yet there are convergences. Both Jung and Frankl rejected the reduction of suffering to purely biological or mechanical terms. Both saw it as potentially meaningful at a higher level. Both believed that how we respond to suffering matters profoundly. Both saw their work as helping people transform suffering rather than merely eliminate it. Both recognized that some of life's deepest growth comes through difficulty rather than comfort. The difference is that Jung looked for the meaning in the suffering's message about needed psychological work, while Frankl looked for the meaning in the conscious choice about how to bear it. Jung asked, "What is the suffering trying to tell you? What does it say about what needs to change in your psyche?" Frankl asked, "How will you respond to this suffering? What attitude will you choose? What will you make of this?" Perhaps we could say that Jung's approach is more appropriate for suffering that results from psychological conflicts and has a psychological resolution, while Frankl's approach is more appropriate for suffering that is simply given, unavoidable, without psychological remedy. Neurotic suffering might need Jungian analysis. Existential suffering might need Franklian courage and meaning-making. But in practice, many instances of suffering have both psychological and existential dimensions, calling for both approaches. Their views on religion and spirituality also reveal important differences and convergences. Jung, though the son of a pastor, was not conventionally religious. He had a famous dream in his youth of God defecating on the Basel Cathedral, an image that expressed his early loss of faith in traditional Christianity. Yet he remained deeply engaged with religious questions throughout his life. He studied Christian symbolism, Eastern religions, Gnosticism, alchemy, as a form of religious philosophy. His concept of the self had religious overtones. It was the God image within, the organizing center that transcends the ego. Jung saw religion as psychologically necessary. The human psyche, he argued, has a religious function. We need connection to something larger than the ego, need symbolic life that gives us relationship to the transpersonal dimension. When traditional religions lose their vitality, when dogmas become empty shells, psychological problems result. People lose contact with the archetypal depths, become one-sided and rationalistic, project their unused spiritual energies into political ideologies or neurotic symptoms. But Jung's interest in religion was primarily psychological. He famously said, "I don't believe, I know," meaning that his knowledge of God was psychological, based on the empirical reality of religious experience within the psyche. Whether God exists objectively outside the psyche was a question he considered beyond his competence as a psychologist. What he could say was that the God image exists within the psyche, that it has powerful effects, that it represents something real about the structure of human consciousness. This led to a complex relationship with religious believers. Some appreciated Jung's psychological understanding of religious symbolism, finding in it a way to maintain religious life while accommodating modern consciousness. Others saw Jung's approach as reductionistic, reducing God to a psychological projection. Jung insisted he was not denying the objective existence of God, only describing the psychological side of religious experience. But the distinction was not always clear. Frankl's relationship with religion was different. He came from a Jewish background, though was not strictly observant. His experience in the camps deepened rather than destroyed his faith, though it was a faith that questioned and struggled. He saw logotherapy as compatible with religious faith, but not requiring it. One could be a convinced atheist and still practice logotherapy, because the search for meaning does not depend on God's existence. Yet Frankl's thought has deeply religious dimensions. His emphasis on self-transcendence, on meaning discovered rather than created, on values that call to us rather than being invented by us, all this suggests a reality that transcends the purely subjective. When Frankl says that meaning is objective, waiting to be discovered, he implies that the universe is meaningful, that existence itself has purpose. This is not far from religious claims about a meaningful creation. Frankl distinguished logotherapy from pastoral care, insisting that the logotherapist addresses the specifically human dimension without making religious claims. But he also acknowledged that the search for meaning ultimately raises religious questions. What is the meaning of the whole? What is ultimate meaning? These questions point beyond what psychology can answer, entering the realm of theology and philosophy. Frankl's personal answer included faith in what he called ultimate meaning, a trust that existence as a whole is meaningful even if we cannot comprehend the full meaning. Both Jung and Frankl, then, were post-religious, but not anti-religious. Both had moved beyond conventional religious belief, but maintained deep respect for religious questions and experiences. Both saw their psychological work as addressing the spiritual dimension of human existence without claiming to have final answers to ultimate questions. Both believed that modern secularism, while liberating in some ways, had left a vacuum that needed filling. The difference is that Jung filled that vacuum with psychology, with the depths of the collective unconscious and the process of individuation. Frankl filled it with existential commitment to meaning discovered in concrete situations. Jung's approach is more mystical, more focused on inner experience and symbolic life. Frankl's approach is more ethical, more focused on responsibility and engagement with the world. but both were addressing the same crisis, the need for meaning, purpose, and connection to something larger than the isolated ego. Let us now turn to their legacies and the dialogue that continues between their approaches. Jung died in 1961, having established a school of analytical psychology with training institutes around the world. His influence extended beyond professional psychology into literature, art, religious studies, and popular culture. The concepts of extroversion and introversion, of psychological types, of archetypes, and the collective unconscious, these became part of the common vocabulary. His influence on the human potential movement of the 1960s and 70s was substantial, though not always in ways he would have approved. His idea of individuation was sometimes reduced to self-actualization, his complex understanding of the psyche simplified into pop psychology. Within professional psychology, Jung's influence has been mixed. Academic psychology largely dismissed his theories as unscientific, too mystical and speculative to be tested empirically. The collective unconscious and archetypes remain controversial concepts, neither proven nor disproven to most psychologists' satisfaction. Cognitive and behavioral approaches that dominated academic psychology in the later 20th century had little use for Jungian depth psychology, yet Jungian analysis continues to thrive in its own sphere. Jungian analysts practice around the world, working with patients through dream analysis, active imagination, and the individuation process. Jungian ideas have influenced depth psychotherapy more broadly, even therapists who do not identify as Jungian. The attention to symbolism, the respect for the unconscious, the focus on meaning and purpose, these have been incorporated into many therapeutic approaches. Jung's influence has been particularly strong in religious studies, mythology, and the arts. Joseph Campbell's work on comparative mythology, deeply influenced by Jung, reached a mass audience. James Hillman's archetypal psychology developed Jung's ideas in new directions. The use of Jungian concepts in literary criticism and film analysis continues. Artists and writers continue to find inspiration in Jungian ideas about creativity and the unconscious. Frankl died in 1997, having seen logotherapy spread globally. Training institutes in different. Logotherapy exists on every continent. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, has been translated into dozens of languages and continues to sell widely. His influence has been particularly strong in counseling and humanistic psychology, in pastoral care and spiritual direction, in education and business. His ideas about meaning, self-transcendence, and tragic optimism have resonated with diverse audiences. Within academic psychology, Frankl's influence has also been mixed. Logotherapy is sometimes dismissed as more philosophy than psychology, too focused on meaning and values to fit behaviorist or cognitive paradigms. The emphasis on freedom and choice sits uncomfortably with deterministic models of human behavior. The spiritual dimension Frankl emphasized has no place in materialist psychology. Yet interest in Frankl's ideas has grown in recent decades. The positive psychology movement, while different from logotherapy, shares the emphasis on meaning and purpose. Research on meaning in life, on post-traumatic growth, on resilience, all this resonates with Franklian themes. Existential psychotherapy, influenced by Frankl among others, continues to develop. Clinicians working with terminal illness, addiction, trauma, and existential crises often find Franklian concepts useful. Frankl's influence extends beyond professional psychology. His ideas have influenced business and organizational development, with leaders exploring how to create meaning in work. His concepts are used in education, helping students find purpose and direction. His story of surviving the camps through meaning continues to inspire people facing their own difficulties. His vision of tragic optimism offers an alternative to both naive optimism that denies suffering and pessimism that sees only suffering. The dialogue between Jungian and Franklian approaches continues in various forms. Some therapists have tried to integrate both approaches, recognizing their complementary strengths. There are Jungian analysts who incorporate existential and meaning-oriented questions into their work. There are logotherapists who have studied Jungian ideas and find ways to incorporate attention to dreams and symbolism. The division between the approaches is not absolute. Practitioners on both sides recognize value in the other's insights. We might identify several areas where integration seems most promising. First, in working with life transitions and identity questions, Jungian approaches excel at helping people explore who they are becoming, using dreams and symbolic work to illuminate the individuation process. Franklian approaches excel at helping people clarify what they will do, what responsibilities call them, what meanings they will pursue. Combining these could address both the who and the what of identity and purpose. Second, in addressing suffering, Jungian approaches help people understand the symbolic meaning of their suffering, what it says about needed psychological growth. Franklian approaches help people choose how to respond to unavoidable suffering, transforming it through attitudinal values. Some suffering might need both understanding its psychological roots and choosing a meaningful response to it. Third, in spiritual and religious questions, Jungian approaches explore the psychological dimension of religious experience, using mythological and archetypal frameworks. Franklian approaches explore the existential dimension of religious commitment, the search for ultimate meaning. Together, they might address both the inner experience and the outer commitment that religion involves. Fourth, in working with creativity and vocation, Jungian approaches explore the unconscious sources of creative inspiration, the personal myth that shapes one's calling. Franklian approaches explore the conscious values and purposes that guide creative work and vocational choice. Combining them could address both the depths from which creativity emerges and the meanings toward which it aims. The integration is not seamless. Real differences remain in their philosophical assumptions. Jung's trust in the unconscious and Frankl's emphasis on consciousness, Jung's focus on the symbolic and Frankl's focus on the concrete, Jung's introspective method and Frankl's action-oriented approach, these reflect genuinely different visions of human nature and what healing requires. One cannot simply combine them without tension. Yet the tension itself might be productive. Perhaps we need both perspectives, need to hold them in creative dialogue. Perhaps the human reality is complex enough to require multiple approaches. We have depths and heights, unconscious and conscious, psychological and spiritual dimensions. We need both integration and transcendence, both symbolic life and meaningful action, both inner work and outer engagement. In contemporary culture, we see the need for both. Many people suffer from disconnection from their depths, from living entirely in the ego and persona, from identification with roles and achievements. They need something like Jung's approach, need to reconnect with the unconscious, need to discover their personal myth and engage in individuation. But many people also suffer from excessive introspection, from self-preoccupation, from the narcissism of a therapeutic culture that makes everything about inner states. They need something like Frankl's approach, need to shift focus from themselves to what matters beyond themselves, need to find meaning through engagement with the world. The ideal might be a kind of oscillation or rhythm between the two approaches, times for depth work, for introspection, for engaging with dreams and symbols and the inner world, times for existential commitment, for action, for service, for engagement with concrete responsibilities, times for integration, times for transcendence, times for discovering who we are, times for deciding what we will do. This oscillation reflects the fundamental rhythm of human existence. We are both subjects and agents, both beings who are shaped and beings who choose. We have depths that influence us and heights toward which we aspire. We are both psychological creatures with complex inner worlds and spiritual beings oriented toward meaning and transcendence. Jung and Frankl each specialized in one side of this reality, and we need both sides for a complete picture. As we move toward the conclusion of this exploration, let us dwell in the space between their perspectives, allowing their different visions to illuminate each other. Imagine them again in conversation, perhaps in that timeless realm where ideas meet unencumbered by ego or competition. What might they say to each other? Jung might say to Frankl, "I respect your emphasis on conscious choice and responsibility, but you underestimate the power of the unconscious. People cannot simply choose their attitudes when profound unconscious forces are at work. The person shaped by childhood trauma, by unresolved complexes, by archetypal patterns they do not understand, such a person lacks the inner freedom you assume. They need psychological work first, need to integrate shadow and anima, need to understand the forces that shape them before they can truly choose. Your experience in the camps was extreme and taught you something important. But most people's lives are not so stark. They have the luxury and the burden of deeper questions. They need to know not just how to survive or what attitude to choose, but who they are, what their unique nature is, what personal myth they are living. These questions require engagement with the symbolic dimension, with dreams and imagination, with the depths you neglect. You are right that excessive introspection can be a problem, that people can become lost in self-analysis. But the solution is not to abandon the inner world for pure outward focus. The solution is to engage with the inner world in service of the outer world, to ground outer action in inner alignment with the self. Without this connection to the depths, action becomes shallow, conformist, driven by persona rather than authentic individuality. And while I appreciate your emphasis on meaning discovered in the world, you miss the fact that we bring psychic patterns to our perception of the world. What one person sees as meaningful, another does not. This is because archetypal patterns shape our perception. The person in whom the healer archetype is active will see opportunities for healing everywhere. The person in whom the warrior archetype is active will see battles to fight. Meaning is not simply objective, waiting in the world, but emerges in the interaction between psyche and world. Frankl might respond, "Your approach risks making people passive victims of unconscious forces. You tell them that complexes and archetypes shape their lives, that they must wait for the unconscious to reveal their path, that they cannot choose until they have done years of depth work. This delays and excuses inaction. People use analysis as a refuge from the demands of life, endlessly exploring their own psyches while avoiding responsibility. Your experience was comfortable enough that you could afford this depth exploration. But for people in crisis, for people facing real suffering, for people who need to act now, your approach offers little. They cannot wait for their dreams to provide guidance or for the individuation process to run its course. They need to choose, to act, to find meaning in their immediate situation. You are right that unconscious factors influence us, but you overestimate their power and underestimate human freedom. Even people with severe trauma, with profound psychological wounds, retain the capacity to choose their attitude. I saw this in the camps, people with every reason to despair who nonetheless maintained their dignity, made choices about how to respond to horror. If freedom exists there, it exists everywhere. Your emphasis on the symbolic and mythological is beautiful, but can become an escape. People can become fascinated with archetypes and myths while neglecting the concrete responsibilities before them. The woman suffering from your empty nest syndrome does not primarily need to understand her anima or explore mythological images of the mother. She needs to detect the new meanings that life presents to her now that her children are grown. She needs to shift from the creative values of motherhood to new creative or experiential or attitudinal values. And while I respect your insight that psyche has patterns, you risk determinism. You suggest that people are living out archetypal patterns, that there are only so many basic myths. This denies the uniqueness of each person's situation. I am not living the hero's journey or any other universal pattern. I am living my unique, unrepeatable life with responsibilities and meanings that are mine alone. The task is not to find which archetype fits me, but to detect the meanings that my particular situation demands. Jung might reply, but your uniqueness is not as absolute as you suggest. You are also universal, participating in the collective unconscious, embodying archetypal patterns. Your very insistence on the uniqueness of your suffering reveals an archetypal pattern, the wounded healer, who transforms personal suffering into healing work for others. You lived that pattern, whether you acknowledge it or not, and your emphasis on consciousness and choice, while empowering, can become burdensome. You place enormous responsibility on people to choose the right attitude, to find meaning even in extremity. But what of those who cannot do this? What of those who despair, who lose hope, who cannot find meaning? Your approach can become moralistic, implying that if people suffer, it is because they have not chosen correctly. The unconscious offers grace, in a sense. It says, you are being guided, even when you do not know it. The symptoms you suffer from are meaningful, are trying to help you. The dreams you have are gifts, are guidance from a deeper wisdom. You do not have to do it all consciously. The self has its own trajectory, its own intelligence. Your task is to cooperate with this process, not to do it all through conscious willpower. Frankl might respond, and yet your trust in the unconscious can become fatalistic. If the self is guiding, if archetypes determine the patterns, where is freedom? You speak of individuation as if it is something that happens to people rather than something they choose. You make human beings too passive, too much the objects of psychological forces. My approach does place responsibility on people, but this is not burden, but dignity. To say that we can choose our attitude even in extremity is to affirm human dignity at its core. We are not merely psychological mechanisms, not merely expressions of archetypal patterns. We are free beings, capable of taking a stance toward our own conditioning, toward our circumstances, toward our fate. Yes, some people fail to find meaning, fail to choose life-affirming attitudes. This is tragic. But the possibility of failure makes the achievement meaningful. If we could not fail to find meaning, then finding it would not be an achievement. The camps proved that human dignity is not given but earned, not inevitable but achieved through choice in the face of forces that seek to destroy it. This imagined dialogue reveals that their differences are not merely technical but philosophical, rooted in different visions of human nature and freedom. Yet notice that they would probably understand each other better than many of their followers do. Both were sophisticated thinkers, both recognized complexity, both knew their approaches had limitations. The dialogue between them would be respectful, mutually enriching, even if not fully resolved. In the end, perhaps we should hold both visions simultaneously. We are shaped by unconscious forces, and we are free. We have depths that influence us, and we can transcend our conditioning. We discover meaning through engaging with the symbolic dimension, and we discover meaning through conscious engagement with concrete situations. We need integration, and we need transcendence. We are both psychological and spiritual beings, both subjects of depth and agents of height. Jung's great gift was revealing the depths, showing us that consciousness emerges from and remains connected to the vast unconscious, that we are beings of symbol and myth, that individuation is a lifelong journey toward wholeness. His work reconnected modern people with the archetypal dimension, with the religious function of the psyche, with the creative power of the unconscious. He showed that symptoms and dreams are meaningful, that neurosis can be the occasion for growth, that we are larger than we know. Frankl's great gift was revealing the heights, showing us that we are oriented toward meaning, that we transcend ourselves toward values and purposes, that we retain freedom even in extremity. His work affirmed human dignity in the face of forces that sought to destroy it. He showed that suffering can be meaningful through our response to it, that meaning is discovered rather than created, that we are most human when we are absorbed in something beyond ourselves. Together, they map the full dimensions of human existence, the depths and the heights, the unconscious and the conscious, the psychological and the spiritual, the symbolic and the existential. We need both maps for the journey of becoming fully human. In the quiet of this late hour, as we near the end of our exploration, let these two visions rest together in your mind. Jung, descending into the depths, painting the images from his unconscious, dialoguing with figures from the collective psyche, trusting the self's guidance. Frankl, standing, upright in the camps, choosing his attitude, finding meaning in horror, affirming freedom even when all outer freedom is stripped away. Both are teachers, both are guides, both show us something essential about what it means to be human. Perhaps the deepest convergence between them lies in their shared conviction that human life has purpose and meaning. Both rejected the reductionism that sees us as merely biological machines or products of social conditioning. Both affirm that we are meaning-seeking beings, that our deepest need is not for pleasure or power, but for purpose, for a sense that our lives matter. Both saw their work as addressing the spiritual crisis of modernity, the loss of traditional sources of meaning, the need for new frameworks that honor both scientific understanding and existential needs. They differed in how they thought meaning emerges. Jung through engagement with the unconscious, Frankl through conscious engagement with life's demands. But both agreed that meaning exists, that it can be found, that finding it is essential to psychological and spiritual health. In a world that often seems meaningless, in a century that witnessed unprecedented horrors, both men held fast to the conviction that human existence is meaningful, and that this meaning can sustain us through whatever we must endure. This shared conviction is perhaps their greatest gift. In their different ways, both say, "Your life matters. Your struggles are not in vain. Meaning is possible even in difficulty. You are part of something larger than yourself." These are not simply comforting lies, but empirical observations drawn from their work with thousands of people, from their own life experiences, from their deep study of human nature. Jung observed that people who found their way in analysis, who engaged with their dreams and worked toward individuation, experienced life as meaningful. They felt connected to something larger, felt their lives had purpose and direction, felt that their suffering served growth. The process of individuation itself is meaningful. The gradual realization of one's unique potential, the journey toward wholeness, the discovery of one's personal myth. Frankl observed that people who had a why could bear almost any how, that those who found meaning could survive and even grow through terrible suffering. He saw that meaning was not dependent on circumstances but on attitude, that people could find or create meaning in any situation. The search for meaning itself is meaningful, the attempt to detect what life demands, to respond to the unique call of one's situation, to bear witness through one's choices to human dignity. Both observe that meaning comes not through self-preoccupation but through self-transcendence in some form. For Jung, transcendence of the ego through relationship with the self, the larger totality of the personality. For Frankl, transcendence through orientation toward values, purposes, and people beyond oneself. But both saw that we find ourselves by moving beyond ourselves, that the ego must serve something larger, that meaning emerges in this movement toward the transpersonal. As we come to rest in these final reflections, consider how Jung and Frankl together illuminate the landscape of human consciousness. Imagine consciousness as a territory with multiple dimensions. There is the surface level of daily life, the ego, the persona, the routines and roles we inhabit. Below this lies the personal unconscious, the realm of forgotten memories and repressed conflicts that Freud mapped. Below this lies the collective unconscious, the realm of archetypes and universal patterns that Jung revealed. Above the surface lies what Frankl called the noological dimension, the realm of meanings, values, and purposes that transcend the purely psychological. We are beings who inhabit all these dimensions simultaneously. We have daily lives and deeper patterns, personal histories and universal natures, psychological dynamics and spiritual orientations. Any complete understanding must account for all these levels. Jung mapped the depths below consciousness, Frankl mapped the heights above it. Together they give us a more complete picture than either alone could provide. In practical terms, this means we need different approaches at different times. Sometimes we need to descend, to explore dreams and symbols, to integrate shadow material, to connect with archetypal depths. Sometimes we need to ascend, to clarify values and purposes, to commit to meaningful action, to transcend through service. Sometimes we need to work with the personal unconscious, understanding how past experiences shape present patterns. Sometimes we need to work with the collective unconscious, connecting with universal images and myths. Sometimes we need to work with consciousness itself, exercising choice and responsibility. The rhythm of a meaningful life might involve movement through all these dimensions. Periods of introspection and depth work, followed by periods of engaged action in the world. Times of receiving images and insights from the unconscious, followed by times of bringing those insights into concrete form. Times of struggling with suffering and finding meaning in it, followed by times of joy and creativity, times of individuation and times of self-transcendence, times of integration and times of service. Jung and Frankl were both guides to this rhythm, though they emphasized different aspects of it. Jung taught the descent and the return, the hero's journey into the unconscious and back to the world with new wisdom. Frankl taught the choice and the transcendence, the human capacity to find meaning and maintain dignity regardless of circumstances. Both are needed for the full human journey. Consider one final image to hold both their visions. Imagine a tree. Its roots extend deep into the earth, drawing nourishment from the dark soil, from the collective depth, from the symbolic and archetypal substrate. These roots are Jung's domain, the collective unconscious, the personal complexes, the shadow that must be acknowledged, the archetypal patterns that structure experience. The tree cannot flourish without strong roots, without connection to these depths. But the tree also reaches upward, its branches extending toward the sky, its leaves turning toward the light, participating in the larger ecosystem through photosynthesis and oxygen production. This upward reach is Frankl's domain, the orientation toward meaning, the self-transcendence that moves beyond oneself, the engagement with values and purposes that call us upward. The tree cannot flourish without this reaching toward light, without this participation in something larger. The trunk connects roots and branches, depths and heights, ground and sky. This is consciousness itself, the ego that mediates between unconscious and world, between inner depths and outer meanings. The trunk must be strong enough to channel energy both ways, bringing up nourishment from the roots and bringing down light captured by the leaves. This strength comes from both directions, from integration of the depths and from commitment to transcendent purposes. A healthy tree has both strong roots and far-reaching branches. Cut off the roots, and the tree withers from lack of nourishment from the depths. Cut off the branches, and the tree cannot breathe, cannot participate in the larger life of the forest. Both are essential. Jung tends the roots. Frankl prunes the branches toward the light. But both are cultivating the same tree, the same human life seeking to flourish. This image suggests that the supposed conflict between depth and height, between Jung and Frankl, is false. We need both. The person who is all roots, all depth, all unconscious engagement becomes lost in the inner world, disconnected from life's practical and ethical demands. The person who is all branches, all height, all conscious striving toward meaning becomes rootless, disconnected from the depths that nourish authentic action. The goal is the integrated tree, rooted in the depths and reaching toward the heights, drawing nourishment from the collective unconscious and extending toward transcendent meanings. In this integration, suffering takes on a double significance. In Jungian terms, suffering signals that the roots are blocked, that connection to the depths is impaired, that integration is needed. Attend to the roots, clear the blockages, allow the unconscious to nourish consciousness again. In Franklian terms, suffering is an opportunity to reach higher, to demonstrate attitudinal values, to transform the experience through the stance we take toward it. Reach upward toward meaning, toward the light, toward transcendence. Both are true. Both are needed. The same is true for joy and creativity. In Jungian terms, these come from the depths, from connection with the creative unconscious, from alignment with the self's trajectory. The artist who is blocked needs to reconnect with the imaginal realm, needs to listen to dreams, needs to practice active imagination until images flow again. In Franklian terms, creativity comes from engagement with the world, from detection of what wants to be expressed, from commitment to bring something of value into being. The artist who is blocked needs to stop waiting for inspiration and engage with the work, trusting that meaning emerges through action. Both are true. Both work, and the same for love. In Jungian terms, love involves projection of anima or animus, involves encounter with another who carries an image from the unconscious, involves a process of withdrawing projection and coming to see the other as they actually are. Love is a path of individuation, a relationship that calls forth hidden aspects of oneself. In Franklian terms, love is the ultimate form of self-transcendence, the absorption in another person, in their uniqueness and value, the experience of meaning through encounter with another human being. Love is not about oneself, but about the beloved. Both are true. Both illuminate different aspects of love's mystery. As this exploration draws to a close, as the night deepens and sleep beckons, let us hold one final thought. Jung and Frankl were both physicians of the soul, both healers, both guides to those who suffer and seek. They worked in different times, used different methods, emphasized different dimensions of human existence, but they shared a fundamental commitment to help human beings live more meaningful, more authentic, more fully realized lives in an age that often seems to have lost its way, that reduces human beings to consumers or producers, that offers endless distraction but little meaning. Their voices remain relevant. Jung reminds us that we have depths, that consciousness emerges from and remains connected to vast unconscious realms, that we are beings of symbol and myth, that our symptoms and dreams carry messages worth attending to. Frankl reminds us that we have heights, that we are oriented toward meaning beyond ourselves, that we retain freedom even in difficulty, that our response to suffering can transform it into something meaningful. Together, they offer a vision of human being as both deep and high, both shaped by unconscious forces and free to choose, both psychological and spiritual, both in need of integration and capable of transcendence. This vision honors the full complexity of human existence. It does not reduce us to mechanisms or instincts. It does not make us purely free agents, disconnected from depths. It sees us as we are creatures of the between, inhabiting the space between depth and height, between unconscious and conscious, between nature and spirit. In this space between, we make our lives. We descend to the depths to find nourishment, to encounter our shadows, to receive images from the collective unconscious. We ascend toward the heights to find meaning, to commit to values, to transcend our circumstances through the attitude we choose. We integrate what we find in the depths and bring it forth in service of meanings we detect in the heights. We are the living bridge between depth and height, between Jung's realm and Frankl's, between the roots and the branches of the tree of life. Let this vision accompany you into sleep and into your waking life. When you struggle with questions of meaning and purpose, remember both Jung and Frankl. Ask both, what do my depths tell me through dreams and symptoms? And what do my circumstances demand of me right now? Listen both inward to the unconscious and outward to the world. Seek both integration of shadow and commitment to transcendent purposes. Tend both the roots and the branches of your being. Neither Jung nor Frankl has the complete answer, because the complete answer must include both depth and height, both unconscious and conscious, both psychological and spiritual dimensions. But together they offer tremendous resources for the journey of becoming fully human. Draw on both. Let Jung help you understand the symbolic language of your depths. Let Frankl help you clarify your values and find meaning in your circumstances. Let both accompany you on the journey toward wholeness and transcendence, toward integration and meaning, toward becoming who you are meant to become. In the end, both men offer the same essential message, expressed in different languages. Your life has meaning. Your struggles are not in vain. You are part of something larger than yourself. You have depths to explore and heights to reach. This message is as needed now as when they first offered it. In a world that often seems meaningless, in lives that often feel empty, their voices remind us that meaning is possible, that depth and height are real, that human existence, for all its difficulty, can be a meaningful journey. Rest now in this knowledge. Let the dialogue between Jung and Frankl continue in your dreams, in your depths, in your reaching toward meaning. Let their different voices speak to different parts of you, the part that needs symbolic understanding and the part that needs practical commitment, the part that seeks integration and the part that seeks transcendence. You contain multitudes, as Whitman said. You need multiple guides for the full journey. As sleep approaches, as consciousness softens, and the unconscious rises to meet you in dreams, carry with you the image of these two great souls, Jung descending into the depths with courage and curiosity, Frankl standing upright in the camps choosing dignity and meaning. Both are heroes of the human spirit. Both are guides to the perennial quest for meaning and wholeness. Both are companions for the journey we all make between birth and death, between unconsciousness and full awakening. May their wisdom accompany you into sleep and beyond, into dreams and into waking life, into the depths and toward the heights, on the eternal journey of becoming fully human. Rest well, knowing that depth and height both await your exploration, that your life has meaning whether you find it in the symbolic language of dreams or in the concrete demands of your particular situation, that you are held between the depths below and the meanings above, a living bridge between earth and sky, between Jung's realm and Frankl's, between the unconscious and the conscious, between who you have been and who you are becoming. Good night, wanderer. May your dreams be deep and your meanings clear. May you find both integration and transcendence, both psychological wholeness and spiritual purpose. May Jung and Frankl both accompany you, each offering what you need when you need it, together illuminating the full mystery and meaning of human existence. Rest now in the knowledge that your journey, like theirs, is meaningful, and that depth and height both await your continued exploration. Sleep well.